This past Thursday, I joined 5 rabbis, 4 imams, 2 Christian pastors, and 2 other Unitarian Universalist ministers at a meeting with members of the National Security Council, the Domestic Policy Council, and the Office of Public Engagement in the Eisenhower Building right next to the White House. And it sounds like the beginning of a joke, right? But we'd come together as part of a tender coalition of clergy, compelled by the teachings of our faiths, to ask the administration to use its influence to push for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. More than half of the population of Gaza is sheltering in Rafah, including 600,000 children, many of whom are starving. And whatever opinion you might have about the truth of the situation, these children just want to be happy. And I call it a tender coalition because some of the rabbis spoke of the thousands of years of systematic oppression, not just the most recent trauma of the Holocaust, but of the relentless fear of living in a world surrounded by anti-Semites who would sometimes provide a normalized living experience only to turn around a generation later in murderous villainy. And 2 of the imams, both of whom were Palestinian, shared stories of loved ones living in chaos and feeling powerless as members of their families were killed in the latest offensive. And it was a bit of irony that our meeting had been booked into the Secretary of War room. Yeah, I had that moment. Who's seen Dr. Strangelove? Right? You can't fight in here. This is the war room. That happened as I was walking in. I was like, oh gosh, this is a joke. It was gilded, as you might imagine, floor to ceiling, covered in flags, miniature cannons, and oil paintings. Everything spoke of empire. And we'd been coached through our talking points a few days earlier by Josh Paul, a former director in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, who'd resigned in October over how the Biden administration chose to respond to the crisis. There were messages, he said, that were effective and could be heard. And there were messages that could not be heard. And we had 1 hour to try to influence people who might be able to influence others. And the imams spoke about how Hamas is less of a political party and more of an expression that has grown out of generations of dehumanization, and you cannot bomb it out of existence unless you intend to exterminate all Palestinians. And the rabbi shared about how 3 members of his congregation had convinced him to bring the Torah scrolls down to one of the college encampments so they could have their bat mitzvahs in a setting that felt meaningful to them. And collectively, we spoke of the recent primary election in Maryland, where 10% of Democrats turned in ballots marked uncommitted as a protest. 10% in an election year that feels like there's more at stake than I have ever personally experienced. But as the hour came to an end, the lead representative stood up and said, there are political realities we're dealing with. The Republicans are calling Biden pro-Hamas, and then he walked out of the room. The evening before, a new friend, shared with me his interpretation of the myth of Pandora's box. As you might recall, it was a wedding gift from Zeus to one of the Titans with the warning that it should never be opened. And the bride, Pandora, curious, she looked inside, and all of the evils flew out into the world. But the most famous line, perhaps, does anyone remember it? As soon as I say it, you guys are going to be like, oh yeah, that. Only hope remained in the box, right? Now, my friend, cynical friend, which are sometimes fun. They're fun. They can be fun. But he was cynical. And he suggested that if hope was in that box, then it too was one of the evils because it let us believe in possibilities that we shouldn't. Now, I'm not a cynic. I have hope. I believe an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leaves the world blind and toothless. And I believe that we are the hands and the hearts of love. And if safety and self-determination is the name of the rock that I am called to push up the hill like Sisyphus, I do not take it as a punishment. I take it as a calling. Our tender coalition gathered in the shadow of the White House before we went our separate ways for the day, frustrated, honestly, with how the meeting went, but committed to moving forward as a team. And we parted using words like brother and sister, each of us trying to hold the elements of the story that we are responsible for. Story is the most powerful technology in the world. Story is what determines whether you interpret May 14th as the Independence Day for Israel or the Nakba, the catastrophe for the Palestinians. Story is what creates a situation where some people are called hostages and others are called detainees. Story is what determines if we are guided by anger and resentment or if we're guided by hope and vulnerability. And sometimes it feels like we are born into immovable, unchanging stories. But the truth is that we always have the choice to look and see if the story that is guiding us is real, to see if the story is healthy, to see if the story is bringing us closer to or farther away from the goals we want. We are controlled by what we refused to confront. We are controlled by what we refuse to confront. And too often, we will not confront stories that no longer serve us because they feel so familiar and we are unsure who we will be without them. And as a result, these stories that no longer serve us dictate the direction and meaning of our lives. Now, last October, I shared with you a story that we used to tell in the temple. It was of potatoes boiling in a pot. And the founder of the temple, Zen Master Seung Sahn, said that living in a temple is similar to cooking potatoes. He commented that in the West, because we are so focused on individualism, we wash potatoes one at a time and then put them in the pot to cook. But in Korea, where he was from, people put all the potatoes in the pot together, and as they boil, they cook and they bump into one another, and the friction they generate knocks off the dirt. By the time they're done cooking, the potatoes are clean. Being in the temple is like this, he would say. The fantasy of the tranquil temple and the mindful practitioner is not real. And because it's not real, it's not helpful because we are projecting something we cannot attain. Bumping into one another is real. It is, although we often think it's not that helpful. But it can be if we are willing to be responsible for our elements of the story. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, there is this belief that all sentient beings have karma. Karma, it's attachments derived from past events, both beneficial and harmful. Karma is the collection of everything that came before, everything that brought you to the chair that you are sitting in now. It is the vast, unknowable entirety of all, right? But it very much has an impact, for good or ill, on how your life is shaped. How your great-grandmother treated your grandmother is living inside of you right now in some inherited story, whether you know it or not. The potatoes in Zen Master Seung Sahn's story are people wrestling with this karma. People bump because they are living with stories that cause them to collide from moment to moment. People bump in part because of an action of another person, and in part because of what we bring to a situation. But Seung-san never disparaged the bumping together. He told people that it was an essential part of the path to awakening. Bumping together is the way to get clean. It is the way to see ourselves, to see what we are bringing into any situation if we are willing to look. If we're willing to look. Now, Lynn Millette, our communications chair, liked this story so much when I preached it, she created an image of us as goofy-looking potatoes in a pot. And I love it because sometimes we take ourselves very seriously. This is Washington, D.C., after all. But I think it's actually very helpful to have a funny image to laugh along with. There are serious issues in the world that need us to be the hands and the hearts of love. But if we cannot laugh, we will be too fragile to do the spiritual work that we are called to do. This is why I love this image. We are all living with stories. Sometimes we call these stories the truth. And in this so-called truth, we build fortresses of right and wrong. We build fortresses of right and wrong. And when we live behind fortresses of right and wrong, laughter is inaccessible. As a congregation, as a people, we will never stop bumping into one another because we have karma. We all have karma. Stories that we inherited that live inside of us. But we can learn to see what is causing us to bump and to use the bumping not to point fingers and say, that's not the truth, therefore it's wrong, but to hold up a mirror and say, what am I bringing into this moment of conflict? What thought of mine has been converted to the truth? It doesn't mean that every situation is equal or the same. But what are we bringing in? It's helpful. How can the bumping become part of our communal spiritual practice? How can we begin to see ourselves not just as dealing with other members, but as engaging in a holy conversation, engaging in the spiritual practice of understanding ourselves and the world around us? Because if we cannot talk to people in our own congregation, we certainly cannot contribute in any meaningful way to issues like Israel and Palestine. Yeah, absolutely. It's like trying to build a spaceship without knowing how to change the oil in your car. This is the easy place. Now, I suppose that Lynn created the image not just because she liked the story, but also because this year's been a little bumpy. Maybe it's been a bumpy few years, right? Some potatoes have collided with one another. Some fortresses of right and wrong have been built up on personal interpretations of the truth. And I really do hope that we can agree that there is no such thing as the objective truth. There's just my interpretation of the truth and your interpretation of the truth. And it's okay to hold on to an understanding of what you feel is true. There are some things that I believe that is true. Like there are things that I draw lines in the sand and I'm like, this is true for me. And it's also good to hold the wisdom of the great sage Jeff Lebowski, a.k.a. the Dude, who reminds us, yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man. Truth is an interpretation. And when we forget that, we end up going to war. And sometimes it is really helpful to have a third party guide us in a way that allows us to see that there might be different understandings of the truth. Anybody who's been to couples therapy knows what I'm talking about. Now, as you heard earlier, the board has been working with the region and the UUA to bring in a consultant. Not just to keep us from bumping, but to help us bump in a way that's good for us, right? That keeps everyone whole, that keeps us from going to war. Because there are not two sides here. There is no winner takes all. We're not competing with visions of what we want. We only have competing understandings of how to get there. Now, the UUA was a bit slow, partly because it was understaffed, partly because it's bureaucratic. But they've been a little bit slow at helping the board find a consultant. But now we know, as you know, Reverend Sunshine is coming with us. Person that I deeply respect. We are very fortunate. And I want to give a special moment of thanks to Glenn Sheffield, who has been he has been dogged about getting us a consultant, even when our contacts at the UUA disappeared for weeks at a time. The board will have more to share with you, but I wanted to bring it into the space today because I see it as a spiritual opportunity. I don't make announcements now. I don't give talks. I give sermons. I tell stories. And so for this last point, I want to share with you a story from my personal life, right? Carrie and I have been looking to buy a house, which is complicated in this area because everything's so damn expensive. And twice we've been outbid, and it's very stressful. So after we lost the second house in the bidding, we started talking about, well, how much space do we really need, right? Because maybe that's the issue. And we started to argue. And we said some unkind things to one another. I'm sure none of you have ever been there. And I was huffing in the hallway, getting ready to go leave and write a sermon about what happens when you create fortresses of right and wrong. Yeah, and I was tying my shoes, preparing to say one more thing before I walked out the door. That was really going to prove my point. And I heard these words like, come in, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I am a prideful person. But the truth is I want to be happy. She and I are only going in one direction. We are a unit. We share the same vision of the life we want to lead together. We need each other. And frankly, living with resentment is like drinking poison, hoping someone else will die. And, walking out that door is going to ruin both of our days and not get us any closer to the vision that we share. And being right wasn't that important, and I hate drinking poison. So I walked into the other room and where she was sitting, and we made up. So what's the moral of the story? There is a consultant that is scheduled to come and work with us. The details of the timing are getting worked out. Please give Glenn a hug for everything he's done. But a consultant is not going to solve our problems if you want to be more right than you want to be happy. If you want to drink poison, hoping someone else is going to keel over, that consultant is already a failure. They don't have the power to keep people from going to war. So what do you want? Now here's the sticky part. We need each other. Because even if we say we want to be happy, sometimes we feel trapped by the story that we've nurtured for so long. So what I'm really asking is not that you release yourself, but to help another person, to help a friend who is stuck. Because, sometimes we hear the voice, sometimes we're able to get out of it ourselves, but really sometimes we need someone to reflect back on to us what's important. By asking your friend, do you want to be right? Or do you want to be happy? Because the alternative is war, and that does not work. Let's keep our eyes on the fries. I thought that was so cute. Eyes on the fries. Because bumping is okay. It's okay. It's okay to have some conflict. It's okay that Carrie and I sometimes do this, because it actually, in making up, we go stronger, right? It's actually how we learn not to be self-righteous. But we need one another to remind ourselves of what we really want, which I'm going to suggest is a congregation united in a vision and a mission that helps heal us and the world. And it will take some people who are willing to not just go along to get along, but to hold our friends accountable to this vision, because the consultant cannot do that for us. So, and I don't want you to do this right away, but if you want to be one of these people, I'm going to ask you in a moment to stand or to raise your hand, if sitting is a better option, and say, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? But think it over for a minute. Because some of your friends are going to be upset at you if you actually say that to them. They're not going to love it or even like it. Because what you're asking them to do is examine their truth, which might appear like you are asking them to betray their understanding of justice. But there are not two sides here. There is only one church, and we all share a common vision. Reverend Sunshine can help us, but only if we're willing to help ourselves. Reverend Sunshine's not a magician. So, we've reached the point about if you want to be one of these people. So, if you do, I invite you to stand or to raise your hand. It doesn't have to be everybody, but stand or raise your hand. And this goes for people who are watching at home. None of you, really? Oh, yeah. The question here, it's going to be the one that I've been repeating, right? This is about, are you willing to talk to your friend when I'm like in my truth, right? You are going to come to me and say, Ian, I want to help you, right? Because I trust you. I really trust you, right? There are some people who really trust you, right? Repeat after me. Keep your eyes on the prize. Do you want to be right? Or do you want to be happy? Amen.